The Spin-off Podcast Network. Contact Energy's good plans give you periods of free or discounted power. The more of your current energy usage you shift to these times, the more you could save. Learn more about these plans at contact.co.nz/good plans. Conditions, fair use policy and eligibility criteria apply. Power refers to electricity.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Speaking of your personal heroes, Katy Perry.
Isn't she amazing?
You were quite blown away by that breakthrough for STEM, for women in STEM.
Absolutely. Yeah. So impressive. And the connection to love, inspiring for all of us. Yeah. While she's been training to become an astronaut, I'm actually New Zealand's foremost expert on rare earth minerals now.
Oh.
And magnets.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Like, did you know that technology has advanced so much that you can actually, instead of having the glue-on ones, you can have magnetic eyelashes now?
What are they magneted to?
To each other.
Oh. But then they closed all.
Where did half of the Congo go? Right above these baby blues.
That's right. It's exciting.
Tēnā koutou katoa. This is Gone by Lunchtime. I'm Toby Manhire. Right there, Annabelle Mather, kia ora.
Kia ora.
Ben Thomas, kia ora.
Kia ora.
And making everything sing, Te Aihe Butler.
Kia ora.
Also accompanying us, sitting quietly, in fact, probably sleeping, is Shido, Te Aihe's dog. Now, I just want to say quickly a thank you to everybody who came out to the Gone by Lunchtime live at Q Theatre, especially the brilliant Rebecca Wright, who's a fantastic surprise guest, and everyone in the audience who was so generous, and especially given some of us were being held together by 75 different medicines trying to stay alive. It was a little bit Gone by Lunchtime at Bernie's.
Ben was high as a kite.
Was he?
But I wasn't infectious.
No, neither.
We're in the middle of a pandemic.
No, neither. No, of course not. And a huge thank also to the resplendent Hayden Eastman Mine, who played some mean saxophone. Did we include that in the version that we put out onto the internet?
You didn't go back and listen to it?
No.
Oh. Yeah, we did.
We did.
Was there a highlight?
It was just smoky. It was sexy.
It was.
It was so much. It was it had included, if you listen very closely, some quite incisive commentary on our times, on contemporary Aotearoa. Now, one more piece of housekeeping. Some good news for me and Te here is that we have received some funding, thank you New Zealand, for a second season of Juggernaut.
Yay!
Which is going to be focused on the fourth national government, that is the Bolger and Shipley years and all that. And so just a quick memo to listeners, being the most informed and interesting politics audience in the country. If you have any tips or thoughts or stones that should be turned, drop me a line on toby@thespinoff.co.nz. Always love to hear from you. Today, let's begin with two of the mighty tōtara of New Zealand politics, Christopher Luxon and Winston Peters. Winding back to April 10, in the aftermath of the big tariff binge that Donald Trump had unleashed via Liberation Day and the chaos in the markets and the general sense of disquiet, fear, terror, all that, Christopher Luxon gave a speech, April 10, on foreign affairs and trade, and that's what it was called on the Beehive site, which is material. And he talked about his plans to respond to that storm of activity. He said he would be on the phone later today, talking to world leaders, comparing notes on world trade and testing what we can do together to buttress the rules-based trading system. And he did do that, and there were a whole kind of carousel of pictures on social media of Christopher Luxon on the phone to foreign leaders, including foreign leaders posting them, Bong Bong Marcos, and a bunch of other leaders chatting away. He said also that he would be heading to the United Kingdom later this month, and he's there now as we speak, catching up with Keir Starmer to talk about trade as well as security and other bits and bobs. He's also going to go to Gallipoli, and then he's going to nip over, as I was going to say, as luck would have it, but that's not a very sensitive way of phrasing it. He's going to make the Pope's funeral.
Oh, he is
on
going to go
Saturday.
to the Pope's funeral now.
So that's obviously a very sad event, but
RAL.
in one sense, the timing is good. Anyway, this speech and the following flurry of phone calls, this kind of him, Luxon as the champion of free trade and all that, was lauded by quite a few commentators. And it did seem like a way to develop a response when you're this tiny cork bobbing on the ocean down in New Zealand. What can you do? Not very much, but you can try and kind of assemble a coalition of pro open free trading nations. And so he did that, but not everyone loved it. Someone who didn't love it was Winston Peters. And he, in public, said that he was cross about not being consulted about the speech and this new launch of activity, this telethon of trade. And he also said he said sort of people should settle down and wait till the dust settles, and it was sort of premature, he suggested, to be getting in there and trying to respond before we didn't know how the pieces would fall. And then further, as he went on a tour in the Pacific, he went to various places, including Tonga and Hawaii. He had a go at the language, the bellicose language, suggesting trade war and tariff war was not the sort of language to be using. Now, Luxon said that it was a media beat-up, which I think is a bit of a stretch. And there's a helpful RNZ transcript on their site of all the different exchanges and all the different rhetoric, which suggests to me it's not a beat-up at all. In fact, if anything, if you ask me, which you might want to do, the opposition didn't really make as much of it as they might have. Maybe I missed some of it, but they could have gone harder, I thought. Anyway, it leaves us with various questions, doesn't it? Ben, Annabelle, including, is the approach the right one? Is Luxon's initiative the right one? Should he have given the speech and the new kind of plan to the foreign minister, especially given, I remind you, that speech was titled Speech on Foreign Affairs and Trade? Should he have consulted with the foreign minister before doing that? And is the language appropriate? What do you reckon, Ben?
Yes, I mean, I was one of those commentators who praised Luxon's approach here. This is a real opportunity for him. A couple of years ago, when he became the leader of the opposition, he delivered a series of extremely dull speeches about the importance of free trade and the rules-based world order for an exporting nation like New Zealand, which at the time everyone just sort of yawned about, but now gives
the greatest
him
little country in the world.
A radical resistance fighter. And so I think this is an area of genuine interest for him. As I wrote a couple of weeks ago, maybe, it's right up his wheelhouse, right? He was the manager of a very large consumer, large arm of a fast-moving consumer goods entity, which has something like 168,000 suppliers around the globe, incredibly complex supply chains.
And then he became a pilot.
He understands exactly what's sort of at stake here in the world economy. And if we think back, there have been instances where the Prime Minister has been criticised for perhaps not having a sort of sure footing in terms of what he's talking about in his interviews or speeches. So I think he'd be crazy to pass up this opportunity. I think he's sounded very good doing it, and he's been sending all the right messages, which is that, it's sort of stating the obvious that we're not going to get involved in some retaliatory trade war and sort of join in the side of China and the US, kind of hoping to emerge victorious after the two have punched each other out. Instead, we will continue to pursue high-quality free trade agreements with like-minded countries, which is actually where Winston Peters is as well. There's some small sort of, concern raised about the bellicose language. But of course, Luxon wasn't saying that we're entering a trade war. It's quite clear that there is a trade war now between China and the United States. I think, what is it? The States is now up to about 135% general tariffs on China. And that's without the pre-existing tariffs and like the fentanyl tariffs and all the other added tariffs. And China, I think, is up to 85% on US goods. So, and Hong Kong has stopped sending parcels through to the US. I guess, Peters, you could sort of generously say that he's worried about kind of, stepping into the midst of all this. Probably the last thing you want right now as a small country is to get Donald Trump's attention. But Luxon isn't doing anything that could be seen as, I guess, confrontational. He's just continuing to try and pursue free trade deals. There's no retaliation to the United States. Where I think it comes in is some people have been saying, the orthodox explanation is that Peters, as he nears the end of his time as Deputy Prime Minister and as we approach the sort of halfway mark of the government and head towards the election next year, Peters is going to be off the leash, off the hook, and trying to distinguish himself and differentiate himself from the coalition government. Bearing in mind that New Zealand First has fallen short of 5% all three previous times it's been in an MMP government. That makes sense as far as it goes, but I think it overlooks one important thing, which is that I think the way to look at this difference between the two is actually that it's Christopher Luxon looking to differentiate himself from the coalition government, in the sense that it's an issue that he feels passionately about, it's an issue that he can speak knowledgeably about, and it's an issue where he can look prime ministerial. He can get on the phone in the Situation Room, his office in the Beehive, to the foreign leaders, and he can look like a prime minister and a strong leader, and that's something that has been very, very hard with Winston Peters and David Seymour continuously. It's not so much the tail wagging the dog in this coalition as the dog has two tails and they keep smacking the dog in its face. And so I think actually what we're seeing here is Luxon.
That dog is not going to be allowed access to bathrooms, I don't think.
And so, I think that's the way to explain what's happened here, that Luxon, what was agreed at Cabinet in terms of the response, Luxon sort of took that and then maybe sort of riffed and ad-libbed a little bit about, building a new coalition of the willing, and sort of pushed beyond the bounds in the way that you would normally see a minor party doing. And I think that's just a characteristic of the sort of government.
Interesting you should say that, push beyond the bounds or differentiate. I mean, arguably it's simply a prime minister being a prime minister, whether or not one should need to go and get that cleared. But it does seem in a large part, at least Annabelle, that it is Winston Peters taking umbrage at, taking exception to not having had cleared with him. Of course, remember, he's been travelling the world on various initiatives. He was in Washington, D.C. not that long ago, playing it super careful, walking on eggshells, keeping the head under the parapet when he met Marco Rubio. And, it may be as simple as seeing those images that appeared on X and elsewhere of not wanting to poke any hornet's nest, as Ben mentions.
Yeah, I think Ben's right that obviously Luxon saw an issue come up where he feels very comfortable and confident to take a leadership position, but I'm not sure that the approach he took was necessarily in New Zealand's best interest. I think that in some ways it kind of exposed his lack of experience as a commercial leader, because we make a lot of his business now, but he's actually only been the CEO, held one CEO position before. And I think by all means address the nation, keep calm and carry on. But some of the language used, I understand why Peters would see that as incredibly unhelpful in this situation. By all means, have the conversations with other leaders, build your coalition of potential trade partners, but the language used was bellicose, and he really should have consulted with Winston Peters before, who is, managing all of these important relationships. Under any other government, it may not matter, but Trump is such an unpredictable, irrational force in international politics that I think the lay-low approach that Peters has taken is probably a good one. And by all means, take whatever action you need to, but that needs to be done very diplomatically and quietly behind closed doors without the use of, such sort of provocative language.
If the speech had been given to Peters to review, he would have looked at it thoughtfully and said, no, this kind of inflammatory, outrageous, warmongering language can only be used in relation to public bathrooms.
Exactly.
That is the only war New Zealand is fighting right now. The war on woke. Unlike most wars, the conscription age begins at 55.
But I think, it did put New Zealand in a bit of a vulnerable position. This is a guy who's putting tariffs on Heard and McDonald Island. So, the slightest thing can spiral out of control with him. So I think it's reasonable that Winston was concerned. Ironically, he probably should have taken his own advice and rather than berating Luxon in the media,
right,
should have rung up Luxon and had a quiet convo with him on the side. So he's kind of accusing him of doing exactly what he does every day.
Exactly. This is it. It's one thing to say that probably the correct process would have been for somebody on Christopher Luxon's team to make sure that speech had been cited by the foreign minister and his team. It's another thing then for the response to be rather than a quiet back channel, excuse me, would you mind? This is how we like to see the process,
tone it down?
Versus, actually going out there and saying some quite, again, I encourage people to read the transcript here. It is quite unambiguous in terms of being a slapdown of the Prime Minister. And then subsequently, David Seymour was interviewed by Newsroom, and he was more diplomatic in his language, but he too sort of seemed to intimate that it would have been nice for him to know too when something like this is happening. And so, there are sort of these different kind of, I guess, dimensions happening. One is the overall world scale thing and not wanting to make the President of the United States mad. Having said that, given that he is slapping tariffs on penguins, you don't really see that there's any necessarily kind of any corollary between actual behaviour and his responses, even though sometimes the rhetoric in the White House is that. But then on the more domestic level, Winston Peters could have kept his counsel. He decided not to, and I guess that's why, again, to go back to Ben's point, it does seem a little bit like it's hard to avoid concluding that Winston Peters is starting to kind of wind the machine up. And then there was a separate thing which perhaps we should touch on too.
Is there a higher setting for the machine?
Is there a higher setting?
That's my question.
That's true.
It seems to be in high gear. Is there another gear?
Well, this is,
are we putting it in 4-wheel drive mode? I don't know.
It's discovering, as we grow and mature, we discover new potentials and possibilities, and Winston Peters has hit 80 and gone, whoa, new mode. I've found some new
beast mode activated.
Exactly. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary that he was interviewed by Heather Duplessis Allen the other day, and he said that he turned 80 and he wished he'd organised the trip the other way around, because then he would have skipped over the day of his birthday, but instead he got an extended one as he crossed the date lines. But the man's 80 and he is, leave everything else to one side, full Energizer Bunny, isn't he? It's extraordinary.
He is a force of nature.
The other thing in terms of
for Benson and Hedges,
the other, well, I don't know if he's smoking anymore. The other thing that plays into this perception of entering more oppositional mode ahead of the great transfer of power from Winston Peters to David Seymour is this chatter that's emerged, which may be little more than scuttlebutt, but came out of New Zealand First, acknowledging that they were ready and prepared and steeling for the potential of a snap election. The thinking going, and I think this is probably one of those stories that emerges and gets a little bit of oxygen when there's not much else around, but on the idea that the coalition government has now pushed ahead in the polls. The economic forecasts are still incredibly
pushed ahead
volatile.
in the polls is a very generous appraisal of the polls.
And New Zealand First was preparing for the possibility of a snap election. Labour and Kieran McAnulty, who's their campaign chair, I guess, has said, "Yep, they're up for it and they're ready to go," which is interesting, given they don't seem to have solved any of their major policy dilemmas at this point. But still, I mean, that's the right thing to say. Is there anything in this? Do you think, Annabelle? Anything?
Well, where did it come from? Are they saying, is this because National has indicated that they might be ready to go into a snap election because they're slightly ahead in the polls? Or is this just something or is it that New Zealand First are threatening to withdraw whatchamacallit?
I think it was reported by Richard Harman in Politic when he was discussing the contretemps over the Luxon speech. He sort of idly dropped that New Zealand First had confirmed that their board was planning on was getting ready in case there was a snap election, and that was sort of two things. First of all, sort of like the military parade down the street of Pyongyang to say that you're ready and you're able to fight the campaign, and two, to sort of, give it a bit of a nudge and say, look how, well, we all know that it's stable when Winston Peters is the Deputy Prime Minister, but who knows?
Things fall apart.
I mean, if any of the political parties are circulating that, actively involved in circulating that rumour, it seems to be so profoundly irresponsible to me, given the economic climate that we're in. The last thing the country needs is a snap election. Any more uncertainty is not a good thing, regardless of your political stripes.
I mean, it would be insane, and all the incentives are to keep it together, because whichever party, if a party in government was responsible for an early election,
they'll get punished.
They would be, well, and also,
but that's how the calculus works, right? Like New Zealand First, and I don't think this is really a thing, but the only way it would be a thing from New Zealand's First perspective would be if they could pin it on ACT. It's that kind of, which again is not something that the National Party really loves, but overall we're going to see more of this dynamic, I'm sure of it, as we approach the election, which is likely to be at the usual time, I would have thought, but is trying to kind of swipe away that other tail, right? Tail versus tail.
Yeah, well, if you're going for an early election, if you're if you're any party in the government, you would have to have one of the parties fall below 5% and fall so far below 5% that you or the other party had pretty much scooped up all of that vote, because otherwise you don't have a chance of beating the left bloc. And the only thing that would upset that is if New Zealand First, the wild card is New Zealand First can sort of do a switcheroo and bring Labour back into government, as they've done twice before. But that would involve Winston Peters crowning Chris Hipkins, which seems increasingly less likely. I mean, Hipkins is really not doing anything to dial back the animosity between the two. Winston's State of the Nation was basically a state of Labour in 2023, and let me tell you, sunshine, it's not good. So in any party that sort of was intending for that to happen, it would be, signing a death warrant. And I don't think that any of the parties are actually contemplating that. I think it's just a bit of what we will see more of is a lot of intra-party jostling within the coalition, and we've seen it over the foreign policy speech. I think we'll see it over some of the economic policy as we move forward. We've seen it, in terms of the differing views on ferries. It was, it wasn't easy, but it was very busy, and everyone was fully occupied in the first year and a bit, because it was just ruthlessly pursuing ticking off the commitments and the coalition agreements. Now it's open ground, and everything's got to be triangulated or negotiated between three parties that are actually quite different. And you'll see those tensions unavoidably come up over the next year and a half. But it's hard to imagine what kind of issue any of those parties would be incentivized to bring the government down over.
I mean, I guess one of the other things to remember is that snap elections in New Zealand, as we think of them, 1984, that was bringing the election forward by a few months, 2002, same thing. We don't really do...
Same, yeah.
So we don't really do the year, 2-year terms in that regard. And I do think
so long as we keep whiskey off the 9th floor, I think everyone's going to be fine.
I do think there must be at least part of Christopher Luxon that looks at Australia, where they had, I don't know whether you want to call it a snap election or not, but it was announced with a fairly short campaign. Albanese is reaping the harvest of Donald Trump because Peter doesn't know how to respond to it in part. In Canada, Mark Carney is reaping the harvest of Donald Trump's rhetoric and tax on Canada. And so there is something to say that there could be a dividend of sorts there. I'm not suggesting that this is the plan, but who knows if we got to the point at May or June next year, it's not impossible, it would have seemed to me, that Christopher Luxon could say, given the state of the world, given the state of the economy, what we need to do is right now secure a mandate that takes us through these choppy waters.
I don't see it. I just don't think Luxon would do it. I mean, he's a guy that's done a really difficult coalition deal with two parties who bulldoze him every day. I just don't see him being willing to relinquish the chance of governing any earlier than necessary.
Winston Peters, about time we mentioned him in this podcast. Happy birthday, Mr. Peters, we should say. I talked about how there wasn't an awful lot of domestic news around, and we've been Parliament hasn't been sitting. It's been in recess the last wee while. Christopher Luxon, of course, is overseas now, and if there's one sort of gravitational truth in New Zealand politics, it's that Winston Peters abhors a vacuum. And into that, he has launched yesterday, as we speak, the members' bill that would classify or legislate that the definition of woman as a biological adult female, the blah, blah, blah definition of... He's basically launched back into the culture warrior mode, away from global statesman mode, and that follows immediately after the Supreme Court in the UK issued a definition, which I think is mostly related to the Equality Act, is it called there?
Yeah, the definition in the Equality Act.
Yeah, which in large part relates to the application of that insofar as affirmative action and what is now called DIA is concerned. But anyway, Winston Peters insists that this is not simply a response to the UK ruling, and he's got a point insofar as this was a thing that he was talking about on the campaign trail. To be clear, this is a members' bill rather than something that he's trying to get through cabinet as a government bill.
It's it's Jenny Marcroft's
It's Jenny Marcroft's name, but you wouldn't know it from the way it's being publicised. But on the course of the campaign, remember, Christopher Luxon said, and I quote, "You are on another planet if you want to have a conversation about bathrooms and make that an election issue." And so in answer to the question, why is this not a government bill but instead a members' bill, that might provide part of the answer. It's an attempt to get some attention. It's an issue that is important to many people, but also, the idea that there around the country there are a bunch of people trying to storm bathrooms that aren't consistent with their biological sex is just a nonsense, isn't it, Annabelle?
It's like 0.7% of the entire population identifies as trans. So it's a tiny group of people that are being targeted. But potentially
a vulnerable group of people who have really worrying stats in terms of their mental health and suicide
very,
rates.
very worrying stats, incredibly vulnerable, all of those things, but don't pose a major risk to the safety of New Zealanders or other women by comparison to issues such as, say, family violence. And the ramifications are very interesting because how does this work? Do we then have like third gender toilets? And does that mean that the government is going to spend money building public toilets all around the country to accommodate third, a third gender, which I think is how it's being referred to in the UK? Does the responsibility fall on
like
business owners if you own a restaurant? All
TSA
of those things?
level security outside public toilets just to make sure that everybody gets fully scanned before they go in.
That's right. And then there's a conversation about potential, testing of chromosomes. What does that mean for New Zealand's intersex community? There's actually, I think, is it 5 times more intersex people than there are trans people in New Zealand, about 100,000 around there somewhere. So potentially huge impacts for them as well. Who collects this data? How is it stored? Is it going to be shared with third parties, with police, those sorts of issues? So it just seems like so much of a workup for such a tiny percentage of the population with huge ramifications for them and others. And then you look at other issues like energy poverty, which is something that, New Zealand First used to be a real champion of in places like, Taumaru Nui, where people are paying, 3 power bills. And we see nothing on that when that really affects people's health, their mental health, their housing, all of those things. So it's just, you can't not think that this is about exploiting identity politics to raise the profile of your party rather than working in the best interests of New Zealanders.
So the interesting thing is that this bill is not the bathroom bill. They're 2 separate bills.
It's not the woke bank rule either, is it? The
It's not the woke bank rule.
Bathroom.
Actually, can we actually just take a diversion into the woke banking bill?
Okay.
Because this is part of the war on woke, which is the woke banks aren't lending to fossil fuel mining and extractive industries, possibly because of their own corporate social responsibility and environmental sort of targets, possibly because of sunset industries that they don't see as economical, and this bill is sort of required for the banks to look beyond their woke morality and serve the farmers and the miners that they may not want to otherwise. Not really clear on just how that sort of balancing act in terms of their own commercial kind of judgment will sort of be forced by the bill. But what's interesting about it is that Andy Foster, whose bill it is, the New Zealand First MP, said that he was also very impressed by submissions by sex workers who said that they too were discriminated against by some banks in terms of banking services. And so he's looking at incorporating that into the bill. So then it would be quite a woke bill, I think. And I actually think there's actually a lot of, because there are other areas with banks, they do discriminate on, not entirely commercial grounds where it's just sort of a bit too complex or it's new for them, such as lending on Māori land, So I actually think you could bundle this all into like an extremely woke bill for New Zealand First to push ahead. But on the other fronts of the war on woke, there's the bathroom bill, which will criminalise every girl going to the big day out or laneway. Or
the journos at the media awards too, because they all go into the boys' toilets.
Mass arrests, they're like our version of ICE will just be descending onto the stalls in men's bathrooms at any large event. But in order for, I think, it might be that for the bathroom bill to work, they need the defining men and women bill, because currently the Human Rights Commission and I think the government generally have regarded transgender identity as covered by the prohibition on discrimination on the basis of sex. So, and I don't think that would change it either. The Human Rights Act doesn't actually mention men or women, except in one instance related to pregnancy. And so it's not actually clear what this would do in and of itself. The men-women definition bill, it would make sure that trans men were not excluded from pregnancy protections in various legislation. I did a bit of a keyword search because I was like, when does legislation talk about men and women? I found some forestry regulations which have more onerous conditions on lending unless the applicant is a man or a woman who has taken certain steps. And I was like, wow, the forestry industry is really trying to close out the non-binaries. And I thought, is that a New Zealand first bill that we didn't notice going through? But I think it dated back to the 1960s. So
they can do this whole process at the same time as identifying all the references to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, can't they? Find principles and or man and or lady.
I think for something this important, it has to be carried by a referendum, and using best practice, there should be an open design contest for the whole population. Everyone can submit drawings and diagrams and schema, and then we'll have a runoff, and then we do a referendum on those definitions. That's the only fair way of doing it.
I was, well, I don't know where to go from there. I was going to touch on the other flank that Winston Peters opened up, as he's wont to do this morning on Morning Report with Corin Dan, where he got so cross he threatened to go down to his car and open his, he got so cross he threatened to defund RNZ. Sooner or later, we're going to cut the rot because you're an abuse on the taxpayer, he said, which is, on one level, that's what he does. On another level, come on, man. You're the Deputy Prime Minister. Please. Any thoughts on that?
It's unsavoury.
Yes.
It's unbecoming of a politician of his ilk to be, threatening people's funding because you don't like the question line of an interview.
Defund the RNZ.
I missed that totally. I just lost the thread of it so early on. I could not follow at all what was happening there. That's poor form. You shouldn't be. You certainly shouldn't be threatening state broadcasters. But I mean, especially when you think of sort of, up against the barricades, the real radical, advocacy journalists, you're not usually thinking of Corin Dan. I mean, he plays a pretty straight bat. But look, it's the fog of war. These things happen.
Very good. That's enough. Thanks very much for your company. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Annabelle. Thanks, Tiahe. Thanks, Shiloh. And thank you to you, listener. We will be back before you know it.
The Spin-off Podcast Network.